If protecting the human layer from inbound attacks is a growing concern for you, then you'll love this next session. Our next guests are here to discuss how they protect against these risks without delaying their fast-paced workflows. Here's Preventing Advanced Attacks and Influencing Safe Behavior in Fast-Paced World of Tech with Ashley Bull, Sales Engineer at Tessian, and Ben Aung, Chief Risk Officer at Sage.
Thank you, Stacia, and hello, everyone. I'm Ashley, Solutions Engineer here at Tessian. I'm having daily conversations with organizations about the ever-evolving threat landscape, which is why I'm very excited to welcome Ben Aung, Chief Risk Officer at Sage and Tessian customer. Ben, welcome, and thanks for being here.
Hey, Ashley, thanks for having me.
Great. So can you start off telling me a little bit about Sage, specifically what security pressures you're operating with given the industry that you're in?
Of course. So Sage, for those that don't know, Sage is the UK's largest technology company. We're a software company that makes back office products for small and medium-sized businesses around the world. And so we have a whole set of pressures to manage from a security perspective. As a software company, it's really important that we're agile, we can work quickly and support our development teams and engineering teams with the right sorts of security interventions with as little friction as possible. And we have to manage all of the risks that you'd expect from, predominantly cloud-based software products, just one step away from the internet, with a whole array of attackers that would be, motivated to gain access or compromise the data that we hold on behalf of our customers. And we hold some of the most sensitive data that our customers have. It's their HR data, their accounting and financial data, and so the duty or the custodianship that we have on behalf of our customers is vital and something that we take very, very seriously.
Absolutely. And as you mentioned, sensitivity of data, really the focus there on obviously protecting that, but preventing users from maybe even responding to a malicious email, something that we have daily discussions with organizations about. There's also a lot of discussion surrounding this idea of defense in depth and the zero trust approach. Do you have any frameworks or even guiding principles for structuring inbound security approach at Sage specifically?
Yeah, we do, and those terms, defense in depth and zero trust, they're used so widely now. They've almost become, well, they're buzzwords or even a cliche now. And I think sometimes it's easy to forget what we actually mean by those terms, and think through exactly what risks we're trying to manage and what outcomes or security outcomes we're seeking. At Sage, when we think about zero trust or inbound threats generally, the first question we ask is inbound to what? Because an inbound threat to a user via email is very different to an inbound threat, via RDP to a server or one of our cloud services. And so how we manage those threats or those risks is very different depending on the context. And I think, if you look behind the buzzwords, actually there's some really important lessons for businesses like Sage and many organizations about how you think quite specifically about the risks you're trying to manage and the outcomes you're seeking, and tailor your security interventions and your posture around those risks. Gone are the days where there's a kind of one size fits all. There's one version of defense in depth in a business. We might have, I don't know, 20, 30 different versions of defense in depth depending on the context. And so, on one hand, that's a hugely complex picture to manage, but on the other, it means that we can really think specifically about the risks we're managing in that context that I mentioned and how best to address them.
Absolutely. And I'm curious to hear a little bit more about how you've seen board interest change at Sage regarding inbound threats. For instance, we know ransomware attacks are constantly hitting the headlines, so curious to get your insight there.
Yeah, well, our board, I'm sure, like many boards, are very, very interested in how we're managing inbound threats or ransomware related risks. Particularly our non-exec directors who, are probably part of other organizations, some of whom may even have experienced these threats for real and have had to work through those sorts of incidents. And so I think we don't suffer from any shortage in engagement or interest from the board, but how we put that interest to best use is the trick. And I think, it's a very difficult space, particularly for CISOs. And you often hear it's a live topic of discussion between CISOs about how you both generate and then actively use that board interest, how you explain what are very, very complex technical risks in simple, plain English, or with simple terms without recourse to jargon. And I think winning that situation and really bringing the board on side, making them appreciate some of the nuances and complexity without having to see it all, I think is a really important objective for people who need to report to management about their risks and what they're doing about them. I mean, at Sage, we try lots of different ways of doing that, and I think some of them are more successful than others. I said I'm very lucky that I've got such an engaged board, but it's my responsibility to make sure that I make best use of that time. So what I put into our reports, making sure that we're to the point, we're clear about the risks and what we're doing about them, making sure they understand the bigger picture. So what's our security objective? What's the end game for us? What's the risk appetite that we're working to, and why is that the right one for Sage? And then bringing it to life, with demos, examples of how attacks really happen, even thinking about the sort of diagrams that you might include in a board report, so that they're not just your typical kind of technical diagram. You've really tried to explain, using all of the tools available to you, whether they're visual tools or sort of report writing, exactly how things have unfolded. And then finally, the thing I would say, and I think this is a really important lesson, is that if you're not a technical person or you've not worked in IT or technology for your career, then it's very confusing trying to put together all the pieces of a technology ecosystem in your head. What's a website? What's your back office services? What's your cloud services? What's the other services you're drawing down, the third party services? For a board member, they might not understand how these things either are interconnected or not connected at all. And so really making sure that you set out that kind of bigger picture, that map of all of your technology in a way that's easy to understand, I think will help you, a great deal when you're trying to explain, how an attack or a particular risk might manifest within it.
No, I think that was super insightful, and completely agree with you there that I think so many people, even who do not have experience within maybe IT and security, everybody knows the buzzwords ransomware, or even different types of attacks that we're hearing within the news. But to really break it down, like you said, and I think lay out the bigger picture, it makes complete sense. Now, in terms of this defense in depth approach, I'm just curious, how are you mapping and really categorizing different types of inbound risks?
So, I mean, we think about, as I said, the context that the different services or assets that we're trying to protect exist in. So, the category of inbound threats as it relates to our data centers or our server estate is very different to a sales colleague on the move with a laptop, traveling around the world. And so when we think about inbound threats, we can't think about a traditional enterprise IT perimeter as we might have done, just a few years ago even. We have to think very specifically about, exactly what the target might be, or the objective for an attacker, and how that would play out in real terms depending on the context. And so just to give you an example, we think very carefully about the kind of pressures that, say, our users might be under in different circumstances. Whether because we're a software business, the kind of pressures that an engineer are under is very different to someone working in HR, or someone working in finance. But they're all subject, or were likely to be targeted by inbound threats. But our response and our mitigations might be subtly different. And again, obviously, those mitigations are going to be very different for attacks against services, like a cloud service or one of our products. And so I think, we have used different categories of defense, and that sometimes means doubling up. It means using different tools, or having, multiple tools that effectively achieve the same outcome, but in the different contexts that you're operating. And I think, like many organizations, we've got one foot in the old world where we've got legacy technology that we need to protect and manage. And we've got the kind of new world. We've got the sort of zero trust dream. We've got users on the move. We've got almost perimeterless environment in many cases. And the tooling and techniques that we use to protect that are very different from what we might have done or what we might need to protect from 5, 6, 7 years ago.
Sure, for sure. And especially with, I think, a world that is so remote right now, like you said, and kind of that move to a different approach versus perimeter, where everyone used to be in the office, makes complete sense. And I really like what you said around just the context and that, the pressures that different people within the organization may feel dependent on their role and how they are operating day to day could impact how they might be targeted, and what type of security practices are needed to best protect them. So really appreciate that insight there. Curious if you could tell us a little bit about how you've been working specifically with the Tessian platform to mitigate these types of social engineering attacks that Sage may have seen and many other organizations have as well.
Yeah, of course. And what I really love about uh, the capability that Tessian provides me is that I can effectively tailor the experience or uh, the the support and advice that I give to colleagues to them, because it is cognizant or aware of that user's context, their what the sorts of emails that they might receive on a day-to-day basis. It means that the support and the advice and the nudge that it gets from Tessian is very specific to them, and that's hugely powerful and not something that is easily achieved in any other way, I don't think. And we like many organizations will mandate e-learning programs around security. We have comms channels. We do our best to sort of get out and about in the business and make sure people understand why security is so important, what it means for them. But those things are ultimately going to be some distance away in time from the moment where you want a user to make the right decision. Someone on the train or running for a train, someone at home, like you say, in a remote working context, someone in a rush because they're late for something or they've got a million other things to do, like many of us are every day. And what you are doing, with a product like Tessian, is you are giving them that very, very timely intervention in the moment, in context that's very in a context that's very specific to them, on the basis that in that moment they'll make the right judgment. And that is just such a much more effective way of managing these risks than, I said, trying to treat them several months in advance for an e-learning program, or solely relying on someone having read an intranet article that you published. So I think that's the beauty of it, and I think what's so powerful about the tool.
No, really appreciate that insight there, and completely agree. This is a lot of similar feedback that we've heard from other customers and organizations that we work with. That in the moment training is so powerful because, like you said, right, if a user is constantly looking at emails on a regular basis, right, that distance from their annual awareness training, maybe it was last month, maybe it was 6 months ago, maybe it was almost a year ago. It's really that reminder in the moment that just assists the user so much in making the best security decision possible and really just training user behavior on the fly in the moment. Um, so, I guess what kind of assumptions has Tessian challenged really or made you rethink when it comes to tackling some of these inbound threats?
So, I mean, first thing I say is it provides a completely new data point for us. So, it gives us an insight into uh, who in our organization is receiving what kind of attacks or threats, and in a way that we didn't have before. So, the assumptions that you might make about your enterprise is that you could assume that phishing threats, for example, are fairly well distributed amongst your users. You could make assumptions that teams or business areas that you think are higher risk are going to be disproportionately targeted. And what Tessian does is it gives you, an accurate view through, the interactions that your users are having every day with the outside world through email, and allows you to either to test and confirm those assumptions, or find out, as we have done in a few cases, that they're completely wrong. And I think that is really powerful because, the point we were just making around, the other sorts of training interventions you might make, what you can do is create a very kind of mutually reinforcing situation where, you know very clearly, because you've got the insight and the data to prove it, that particular teams are targeted in certain ways. Therefore, you can make sure that all of the training and support and communications that those teams receive is targeted and focused very specifically about around those risks. And rather than giving them a generic or incorrect sort of feed of communication or training that is based on said an incorrect assumption. So that specificity is really really powerful, and I think is how you can challenge and test those assumptions.
Absolutely. Um, and you touched on this a bit there, but curious to hear from your experience what level of impact Tessian has had on Sage in regards to really the ability to report on specific risks.
Yeah, of course. And, like many organizations, we've been reporting on phishing simulations for a long time. It's a kind of bread and butter statistic or metric that many organizations use in their security programs. And I think what we've now realized is that, while it provides some insight, and gives you some ability to gauge, the efficacy or the impact you're having through your sort of training and communications interventions, it really is very superficial. And so, with a product like Tessian, we can give reporting to either management or board or any other stakeholder in the business really specific examples, which not only help them understand exactly the sorts of risks that you're trying to manage, but more than that, they bring it to life. Like I was just thinking about, when we first started using Tessian, some of the really, it said the real examples of where people had been faced with um, emails that had been tailored, phishing emails that had been tailored to them and their business context, helps you empathize with those users and understand why they might well do make the wrong choice when faced with one of those emails, because that would be a totally normal thing to do. And then equally, when you look at things like misaddressed or outbound risks, misaddressed emails and so on, you can really understand actually how that happens. Where people might accidentally add a personal webmail or something like that address onto a CC field, explaining that in sort of real terms to people that you need to report to, I think allows them to appreciate these risks in a much more real way, rather than in a sort of the generic way, which is we're all pretty desensitized to.
For sure. Ben, thank you so much. This has been such a great discussion. I know I've learned a lot from this, and I know our audience 100% has as well. It's really been interesting to learn about how you've built such an effective security dialogue within your board. And thanks for sharing a lot of those actionable tips and tricks that we can all really take away from. Um, and that is it from us. I will be handing things back over to Stacia, who will take us into our next session.